Paine by John Vail, World Leaders Past and Present Series, Book Review. So this is Thomas Paine. The name of the book is just Paine, but that's because of this weird thing that this book series has going, where they only refer to the subject by one name. And, you know, for somebody like Napoleon or Lenin, that's fair enough. But Paine, Thomas Paine is Thomas Paine. I mean, you can't just call him Paine. He's known by Thomas Paine. Anyways, this is part of the World Leaders Past and Present book review series. Sorry, this is part of the World Leaders Past and Present book series, of which I am doing several book reviews. I'll link down in the description below for my overview of the series as a whole, but essentially they're young adult history books about famous world leaders. Now, you might be thinking, well, Thomas Paine wasn't really a world leader, right? He was an influential politician, but he was never like the president of any country. At least that's what I was thinking. So I'm not quite sure Thomas Paine qualifies to be in this series of books, but I'm glad they included him. I find Thomas Paine a fascinating figure. I'm glad they made room for him in this series, even though, yeah, arguably he wasn't a world leader. He was definitely a very influential political thinker and politician. So Thomas Paine, if you're not familiar, was somebody who was very influential in both the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. And in fact, I remember my 7th grade American history teacher mentioning that. He said Thomas Paine was, I don't think he was the only one. You know, Lafayette was another person who was very influential in both revolutions. But my American history teacher said that Thomas Paine was first the penman for the American Revolution, writing Common Sense, which was like a famous pamphlet that was influential in the American Revolution. And then he went over and became the penman of the French Revolution afterwards. And ever since then, I've thought, boy, that Thomas Paine would be an interesting person to read about, right? Spanning 2 different revolutions. And someday, I do well hope to track down a proper biography of Thomas Paine, like, you know, one written for actual adults. But until that day, this will have to do. And this had enough little fascinating things in it that I'm very glad I read it. One other brief note, I guess, one other small association I have with Thomas Paine. Library where I used to live in the town before actually had the complete works of Thomas Paine in their library. I somewhat regret that I didn't pick it up. But it wasn't a biography of Thomas Paine. It was just, you know, all his writings. It went to several volumes, as I remember. But there was an interesting quote in it that, as far as I can remember, I just flipped to at random. But it was during like the French Revolution, and it was the debate on whether or not the king, Louis XVI, should be guillotined. Now, I don't particularly like Louis XVI. I think he was an awful king, and, you know, he brought most of his miseries on himself. But that being said, you know, like, I don't think anybody should get capital punishment. Like, I think it was a mistake to guillotine him. And there was an interesting quote by Thomas Paine in that book. This is when they're having the debate on whether or not to guillotine Louis XVI. And Thomas Paine at this time had been elected to the French Convention, or whatever the meeting place was, whatever the government was. Even though he was from England, he had been elected as one of the delegates because he was so influential in the French Revolution. And he gave this quote on the debate. He says, he was against Louis XVI being guillotined. And he said, "If on my return to America, I should employ myself in a history of the French Revolution, I had rather record 1,000 errors dictated by humanity than one inspired by a justice too severe." And I just thought, you know, that's a really great quote. And it's unfortunate that he lost that debate, or that he was outvoted, and they ended up deciding to guillotine Louis XVI, because that was really kind of the beginning the end of the idealistic phase of the French Revolution. And then, I mean, everyone knows what's coming after that, the terror and stuff like that. But if they had listened to Thomas Paine, then history could have turned out much differently, and it would have been a much less bloody history of the French Revolution and a lot more humanitarian, and who knows, maybe even some of the subsequent revolutions in world history afterwards might have even followed that lead. Oh, I don't know. This is piling what if upon what if. But I guess the point is, it's really a pity that Thomas Paine's view didn't win out in the French Revolution as well as the subsequent revolutions. This idea of showing 1,000 errors dictated by humanity instead of this bloodthirstiness. Anyways, a number of interesting things I learned from this little volume on Thomas Paine. For example, I did not know Thomas Paine was not an American citizen. He actually grew up in Britain. He only moved to America when he was 37 years old. I mean, I had always thought he was an American, but no, he's actually from Britain. It was also interesting to learn that after the American Revolution, Thomas Paine returned to England for a period and continued his Republican agitation there. He only barely escaped arrest by the British government. He was warned by none other than William Blake, the famous poet and artist, who warned Thomas Paine, quote, "You must not go home or you're a dead man." And then after getting that warning from Blake, Thomas Paine escaped for France and joined him with the French Revolution there. I was also surprised to learn how much of Thomas Paine's life he spent impoverished, very poor and with no money. For all his fame, he was famous both in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution, he hardly made any money off of his writings, even though he had a number of bestsellers. Well, a couple bestsellers at least. After the Revolution, he even complained back to the Founding Fathers about his lack of compensation. Quoting from this book now, page 47, quote, "For all his fame and prestige, Paine enjoyed little in the way of material fortune from his 8-year stay in America. After the American victory at Yorktown, Paine wrote a long letter to Washington complaining of his impoverished condition. 'Well, it was everybody's fate to suffer,' he said. 'I cheerfully suffered with them. But now that the financial crisis had passed and the country was moving into prosperity, he thought it only fair that something should be done on his behalf.'" End quote from page 47 of that book. It's hard not to admire Thomas Paine after reading this book. He comes through as an honest person who sacrificed so much for the cause of liberty. Paine's devotion to honest government got him in trouble with the Silas Deane affair. So this is all explained in the book, but Silas Deane was an American diplomat who used his diplomatic position to line his own pockets in 1778. Now, this was just after the launch of the American Revolution, 1778. So it's sad to see how quickly corrupt politicians were already filling the American government. I mean, just 2 years after 1776. But anyways, Paine used his position as Secretary of the Committee of Foreign Affairs to expose Silas Deane. But as a result, he made a lot of enemies among Deane's supporters. Deane apparently was a politician with some connections. So it caused Thomas Paine to lose his job at the time. And many years later, it almost got him killed because during the terror phase of the French Revolution, Thomas Paine was languishing in a French prison. He had been on the wrong side of one of the factional disputes. I think he was with the Girondists, and when the Jacobins came into power, Thomas Paine got put in prison. And the American government maybe could have helped them or used their influence to get Thomas Paine out of government. But they didn't, because the American minister to France, Governor Morris, refused to help Thomas Paine because Morris had been a supporter of Silas Deane. In fact, Thomas Paine was this close to being guillotined. He only escaped the guillotine by a miraculous twist of fate. Quoting from the book, from page 95, quote, "Paine escaped the guillotine purely by chance. Each evening, the guards chalked a cross on the doors of the prisoners who were scheduled to be executed. One night, Paine left his cell door opened outwards, and the guards mistakenly placed the chalk mark on the inside of his door. When Paine and his roommates returned to their cell, they shut their door for the night, so the mark went unobserved. When the guards made their midnight rounds, they fortuitously passed by Paine's cell." End quote. So, yeah, it sounded like Thomas Paine had a very interesting life. Also sounds like he had some very interesting political views, which is interesting because Paine, I think, can safely be called one of America's founding fathers. I mean, he wasn't part of the convention that drafted the Constitution, and he was British and not American. But you know, Thomas Paine was very influential in the American Revolution. So I think it's safe to say he's one of the founding fathers. And in America, we look back at the founding fathers as, well, yeah, how best to say this? We look back at the founding fathers as like the origin of everything. Whenever you have a political question in America, you go back and you say, well, what would the founding fathers say? What did the founding fathers intend? It's interesting because I don't think Thomas Paine would have appreciated this. Quote from Thomas Paine that's on page 36 of this book is, quote, "No generation has the right to impose its choices upon posterity. Whatever government or form of society was right for one generation might be totally unsuited to the differing needs of another." End quote. So that's Thomas Paine's views on this. So Thomas Paine would probably not have appreciated the fact that we now in 2019 are still going back to what the founding fathers wrote or thought. I think Thomas Paine would say, you know, you guys, you make up whatever best for you in your current time. Yeah, I can think of numerous issues at which this would probably apply to, but I'll leave that aside for now. That being said, if you're going to go back to what the founding fathers said, Thomas Paine, I think, would be very comfortable as a political liberal today. Like, I think he would be on the far left of the Democratic Party. So, quoting from the book, page 71, quote, "Paine not only asserted the superiority of Republican government, but also offered a breathtaking vision of how a Republican government could begin to ameliorate poverty within England. He proposed a series of public policies: progressive income tax, government grants to the poor for education and housing, unemployment relief and public jobs, maternity grants and child allowances, and old age pensions. He insisted that his program was not a utopian pipe dream, but could be accomplished if the government simply stopped fighting foreign wars and ended its financial support of the aristocracy. The needs of the many," Paine argued, "could be satisfied if the selfishness of the few was restrained." That's from page 71 of this book. Now, Paine was talking about England. Like I said, he went back and forth between England and America during his life. Yeah, you get the impression that if Thomas Paine knew how much the U.S. government was currently spending on foreign wars or on maintaining military bases across the globe, that he would probably be turning over in his grave right now. Speaking of which, there's another interesting quote by Thomas Paine from this book, page 20, quoting Thomas Paine. If there is a sin superior to every other, it is that of willful and offensive war. Page 20. So that quote by Thomas Paine should really be put in the Oval Office. Like every U.S. president should have that quote facing them every day when they're sitting at their desk. One more thing I thought was interesting about this book was Thomas Paine's reaction to the conspiracy of equals phase of the French Revolution. So if you're not familiar, the French Revolution in 1795 to 96, there was a attempted coup by a guy who named himself Gracchus Babeuf. And historians usually call this kind of like the first modern communist insurgency in world history. Thomas Paine was in France at the time, and was he in France? Thomas Paine was definitely paying attention at that time, and he had some thoughts on this. Quoting from the book, page 103, Paine wrote Agrarian Justice in the winter of 1795 to 96. The essay was written in the wake of the suppression of the conspiracy of equals led by Gracchus Babeuf, a failed radical coup d'etat that became known as the first communist movement of the modern era. While Paine wholeheartedly condemned Babeuf's uprising, it nevertheless provoked him to reconsider his own political views. Paine argued that political equality could not be eradicated so long as economic inequality persisted. He maintained that the first rule of civilization should be that, quote, the condition of every person born into the world after a state of civilization commences ought not to be worse than if he had been born before that period. Paine retreated from Babeuf's radical solution to economic inequality, namely the abolition of private property, for he doubted that an equal distribution of property was either possible or desirable. Yet his denunciation of poverty and human misery was never more passionate or forceful. Quote, the present state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust, Paine wrote. It is absolutely the opposite of what it should be, and it is necessary that a revolution should be made in it. The contrast of affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together. End quote. And that's from page 103 of this book. So yeah, I mean, you definitely get the impression that Thomas Paine, one of America's founding fathers, would be a liberal today, would be on the liberal side of the American political spectrum. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean anything because Thomas Paine was just one of many founding fathers. So even assuming that you're going to give all reverence to the founding fathers, you do have to sort through what all of them thought and what all of them said, which I haven't done. But it's, Thomas Paine is one piece of the puzzle, definitely. So that is part of America's legacy, I think. Okay, I'll finish here.